All right, so I'll watch the video in 1.5x speed. We'll go over the documentary number one. It's probably gonna take, I would say, like an hour. Okay, so sit on tight. Let's enjoy, and I'll analyze. Okay.
The life we are living now is a miserable, frightened one, living in constant dread of great danger, not knowing what form it may take, and utterly helpless to protect ourselves.
Kate Stone was 21 years old when the Civil War came to her doorstep. In the winter of 1862, the Union troops overran Milliken's Bend, only a few miles from Broken Burn, the family's plantation in Louisiana. Stone watched as bluecoats scoured the countryside for food and supplies and ransacked plantations.
Before the Civil War, the South would have been among the 5 richest societies in the world. To the eyes of the South, this is almost this biblical attack. It's just like...
All right. So first pause here. We're talking about Kate Stone. I think you probably know what Kate Stone, like who Kate Stone is, right? Obviously, Kate Stone is a Southerner. She's a woman. Her father died. Her brother went to war during the Civil War, and she's very privileged and young. She's never really in her life experienced hardship, anything close to what she was experiencing during the Civil War. And for a lot of the South, it was the same. You can see here the documentary explains it to be a biblical attack, right? Attack on religion, like a god. Why? This is because this idea of the black and the white, right? So black is always inferior than the white, and that's what the South believed in, and that's what the South believed God believed in. They thought that God created blacks and whites in a different color to differentiate one from the other, and that's, like, nobody really questioned it. And with the Civil War fighting for black rights to, abolish slavery, they felt like they were being betrayed almost by God.
It's like a plague being brought down on the white South. Their sense of self has been shattered just as their property has. Those are the memories that white Southerners hold too close to them as examples of that their enemy were not really honorable men.
With her father dead and her brothers away fighting for the Confederacy, managing Broken Burn fell to Kate Stone and her mother. The plantation was 1,260 acres with 150 slaves.
Owning 150 slaves meant that they were in the absolute upper echelons of Southern society and Southern wealth. And so she is both a young, privileged woman, but she finds herself essentially on the battlefield and sees Yankee troops frequently, runs from Yankee troops.
Many of her wealthy neighbors abandoned their homes. The Stones clung to their plantation and determined to wait it out. As frightening to Kate as the federal troops were the black men and women now claiming their freedom.
Mr. Hodison's Negroes came out today. 6 men with their children and clothes walked off in broad daylight after a terrible row, using the most abusive language to Mrs. Hodison. The other Negroes declare they are free.
So this is an account, like an example, that during the Civil War, a lot of the slaves started becoming disobedient. They stopped following orders. And you can see here, some of the Negroes, some of the slaves said that I am free. I'm not going to be here, I'm not going to stay anymore. So they just left, or others refused to work for them. And all of this is completely new territory, new information that the white South was not really prepared for. And they didn't even know that the slaves really didn't like their work. Since I've mentioned before, if you were a slave, with no hope of being free, why would you disobey any orders from your owner? If you do anything, it's not like you're going to be more free. You're just going to get whipped and hit, right? So many of the South plantation owners never knew how much the blacks hated being a slave.
And will leave as soon as they are ready.
It was a tremendous shock for many in the planter class to discover, first of all, that the people who worked for them were not happy to work for them. And secondly, sometimes the people who had worked for them were really angry at them.
Kate expresses a lot of fear throughout the war, and it's most often fear of armed slaves. What are they going to do to me, given what we have done to them?
Mother and daughter watched.
So this sentiment of what they are going to do to me after what we did to them. So obviously this proved that the South knew the terrible conditions and the terrible treatment they were giving to these slaves. But they justified it because they were black and they were slaves. But now that there was a possibility that the blacks were going to be free and no longer be slaves, they were scared, right? They lost control of them. They didn't want the South to lose the war, because if that would happen, what would happen to all the slaves they owned? They would come back and potentially kill them with guns.
As their world was upended, until they could watch no more.
This kind of lack of order, lack of control was the most frightening thing to the Stones.
With much difficulty, we got everything ready for the start at midnight. The night was cloudy and dark, with occasional claps of thunder. But we had to go then, or never.
From Louisiana, the Stones fled 300 miles by horseback and boat to Tyler, Texas.
So Kate Stone ran away because this whole rebellion from the slaves and the potential dangers of their lives, both by the black people and the northern Yankee troops, was too much. So Kate Stone and her family ran away to Texas from Louisiana by riding their horses.
There, they joined other wealthy planters who had also escaped to wait out the war.
God will aid us in our righteous cause. The people will fight till the last foe expires, to conquer or die.
Less than 2 years later, General William Tecumseh Sherman scorched a path of destruction across Georgia that ended with the capture of Savannah. In December 1864, Sherman offered the port city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. Union victory was near.
So General Sherman, another very important figure in the Civil War. He was a general. He won a lot of battles and led, the North partly to victory. And you can see here, they took Georgia, right?
Savannah.
And they took Savannah.
In December 1864.
And in December, he told Lincoln, hey, it's almost Christmas time. I got a Christmas present for you. I captured and won over Savannah. And with Savannah, Georgia, being captured and being controlled by the North, the war was almost over. And the North has surely won.
Sherman offered the port city to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. Union victory was near. The general took for his headquarters the mansion of one of the city's wealthiest cotton merchants. He celebrated with his officers, feasting on native oysters and turtle soup. On the outskirts of the city, thousands of emancipated slaves were gathered. They had followed Sherman's army to Savannah, doubling the city's population.
In the book of Revelations, it is written that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And this is interpreted as that moment where God, in his omnipotence, has now come to deliver his people from bondage.
It came so sudden on him, they wasn't prepared for it, recalled one liberated slave. Just think of whole droves of people that had hardly ever left the plantation, turned loose all at once, with nothing in the world but the clothes on their back. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had freed slaves across the South. But Washington still had no clear plan for what to do once African Americans were free.
Okay. So after the North had won the war, Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation. And like I've said many times before, a proclamation is just a saying. Like, he went in public and he gave a speech and he's like, now all blacks shall be free of slavery. And it's like effective immediately. It's not like, oh, within the next 5 years, we're going to slowly, free all the slaves, each one by one. It's like, they're just free now. You're free to go. If you were a slave, now you're no longer. Instantaneous, right? It's not like a gradual process. It's instantaneous. And the way that Lincoln was able to make this happen is because he's in control of the army since he's the president. And so he basically just said that all slaves are free now, and if you don't obey me, I'm going to, send troops and capture you to make sure that, the slaves are no longer. But here raises the question is that, most of the slaves, when they were working on the plantation, the only thing they know how to do is what the owner told them to do. You know, they had no life. They never left the plantation, most of them. So now that they were free, with so much freedom, what do? They don't know what to do, and they don't know how to live a normal life. So that's the next problem. That's the next big problem America had to solve, right? And everyone hoped that Lincoln would be the one to solve the problems. However, as you can soon hear, he was killed after his speech.
On January 11th, President Lincoln sent his Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, to Savannah. Stanton instructed General Sherman to set up a meeting with some of the city's black ministers. He wanted to hear how the freedmen imagined their future in the South. That evening, 20 black men entered the grand parlor as guests of Stanton and Sherman. 16 were former slaves. They chose Reverend Garrison Frazier, who had purchased his freedom 9 years earlier, to be their spokesman. For the first time, federal officials conferred with freed slaves about the future of African Americans in the South.
The exchange that occurs between Sherman, Stanton, and the Union generals and Reverend Frazier is one of the extraordinary moments of the Civil War.
Okay, so Lincoln, one of the last things he did was to send General Sherman, the guy who captured Savannah, to set up a meeting in Savannah between the, Union officials, the federal officials, to talk about the future of the freedmen, right? And to talk about the future of the freedmen, they thought it was a good idea to actually ask the freedmen themselves what they wanted for their freedom. And this meeting was the first ever time that federal officials, in the government had sat in the same room talking about the future of the nation with black people. And they invited 20 black people, right, 20 freedmen as guests. Stanton and Stanton and Sherman, right? And with the 20 black people, 16 of them were slaves before, and they chose one of the guy called Frazier, and Frazier was someone who had, used money to buy their freedom beforehand, and he kind of expressed to the meeting official, the federal officials, what it meant for the black people to be truly free. And you'll find out soon enough that what they wanted was land of their own, right? And also the ability to be able to work and get the rewards that you worked for.
And the ending of the Civil War. Because they asked Frazier not just what should we do with all these refugees, they asked him questions about what the war meant. They asked him questions about what the Emancipation Proclamation had meant. They asked him what the presence of black troops in the Union Army meant. And in many ways, you'll find no better definition of the meaning of the Civil War and the kinds of answers that Garrison Frazier gives that day in Savannah.
The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the Emancipation Proclamation, is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor.
To be a slave, as one of these ministers pointed out to General Sherman, was to be someone who had no control over his life's decisions. And now, these people feel the need to express their abilities, their choices.
The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own.
This was a man who never left probably coastal Georgia in his life. But he understood the Declaration of Independence. He understood the Emancipation Proclamation. And beyond that, he said, in effect, you should give us our rights, and you should protect our rights, and then you should leave us alone and let us be citizens.
40.
Right? So you hear that? They said that, the Emancipation Proclamation meant that to be, for black people to be able to work for themselves, work for themselves and get the money that they worked for, and then use that money to buy some land of their own. And from the land of their own, they would be able to live their lives, free of the control from white people.
Days later, anxious to get thousands of freed slaves off his hands and Washington off his back, General Sherman issued Special Field Order 15. It was only a temporary order, but it became one of the most controversial of the Civil War. Plantations in the rice country had been abandoned by white planters during the war. 400,000 of these acres would be given over to African Americans for settlement. The huge land tract included the Sea Islands and parts of the Georgia and South Carolina coast.
40 acres of land will be given out to each family. Plus, Sherman says the Army's got tons of mules, which we don't really need. They're broken down from our long march. If anyone wants a mule, they can have one of these mules. This is the origin of that famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule.
Here was a real revolution. A revolution in the land, on the land, a chance to be their own freeholders.
So Special Order 15, one of the most controversial and important things that, you know, at the end of Lincoln's legacy has done, which is 400,000 acres of land in Georgia and the Sea Islands, right, were abandoned, most of it, by rich planters in the South when the Civil War had happened. They decided to distribute these land, 40 acres per person, and usually like also a mule, because in the war they had a lot of horses and mules, and they said, you know, we don't need them anymore, so you can take one for farming and traveling. Easier farming and easier traveling, right? So all of a sudden, they went from slaves to landholders. But of course, you have to know, they said it was a temporary thing, right? It was a temporary order. So it was not theirs permanently. And later, we'll find out that they got their land taken away as well. But for now, they got a glimpse of, you know, what it is like to have land and work on your own place.
4 million African Americans in the South. News of 40 acres and a mule spread as fast as the contagion of freedom itself. Many saw this as proof that emancipation would finally give black men and women a true stake in the land they had toiled on for centuries.
Our forces are victorious. Great peace rumors are afloat. General Lee has certainly given Grant's army a good drubbing. We hear that General Sherman is dead.
Through the winter and spring of 1865, Kate Stone and her mother remained in Texas, clinging to every desperate rumor of rebel victory. In April, they learned the true state of things. At a courthouse.
So this is like a little flashback to Kate Stone. You know, they were hearing rumors in Texas where the war is far away, and they're like, oh man, you know, like, oh, we heard that Sherman's dead. Obviously, Sherman's not dead, right? He carried out the whole meeting in Savannah, captured Savannah, and then brought out the court, like Special Order 15. So he's very much alive at the time, but, you know, the South had hoped for any sign of Southern victory. But it never came, right? They were hearing rumors. They were telling each other they were going to win, but suddenly, one day, they got the news that they lost. And everyone was completely shocked, and you can listen to what kind of reactions they had.
House in Appomattox, Virginia, Lee had surrendered his army. The Confederate rebellion had been crushed.
Conquered, submission, subjugation are words that burn into my heart. But degradation seems more than we can bear.
I think those words had particular relevance in a white Southern society that was fixated on honor. Honor and glory, independence were at the core of the white South's understanding of itself, and particularly the understanding that male Southerners had of what it meant to be men, what it meant to have manhood. Because who is conquered, subjugated, that's a slave.
The white South can only imagine that they must have invoked God's wrath in some way. Maybe God is punishing us. But surely he does not mean for black people to be their equal. Maybe slavery was meant to end. But surely God didn't mean for black people to stand alongside whites.
There's a story of a slave who ran away from his master, joined the Union Army, and came back into the South and seized his own master's plantation with his regiment. And he sees his former master and he says, "Bottom rail on top this time, massa." Bottom rail's on top now.
So after the South, you can see that they lost, and they were like, oh my fucking God, like, you know, there's no way, ain't no way we lost. What, you know, why? What did we do to deserve this? Why did we lose? And why was this war even here in the first place? You know, why did is God angry at us? They thought, you know, because they didn't know, like, what to do, since they thought that God created blacks and whites differently for a reason. So they were like, why would you create us differently and now force us to be equal? There's no way. And they thought maybe slavery is a little too much. But why would you ever make it so that the whites and the blacks are on the same level? They felt terrible, disgusted.
In his first speech after the Union victory, Lincoln alluded to the enormous challenges Reconstruction would bring. He even suggested that some black men in the South might get the vote. His words infuriated many, including a Confederate sympathizer who assassinated the president 3 days later. With Lincoln gone, the question of how to put the country back together again took on even greater urgency. Northerners were exhausted by 4 years of war. Most had hoped Lincoln would reconcile North and South and get the states back to normal relations as soon as possible. But there was no consensus on how to achieve this. Just as uncertain was the future of millions of black men and women freed into a society where many whites, North and South, questioned the idea of any rights for former slaves.
The notion of civil rights for blacks was revolutionary. 19th century Americans' whole notion of what it meant to be an American was all wrapped up in whiteness. An American was a person with white skin.
Here you have the great questions of Reconstruction immediately are what people face. Who will rule in the South? Who will rule in the federal government? And what will the dimensions of black freedom be?
Okay, 3 big questions here, right? After the war, the Civil War, Lincoln gave a speech, and then shortly after he was assassinated, everyone thought that he would be the one who helped rebuild or reconstruct the South, and for the South to re-enter the North and be like everything be peaceful again. He died, and now there's 3 big questions, right?
The federal government, what people face.
Number 1.
Who will rule in the South?
Who will rule in the South, right? Who's going to rule in the South? Is the South going to rule themselves, right? Or is the North going to go in and rule the South? What's going to be? What's it going to be?
Who will rule in the federal government?
Second one, who will be in the federal government? Because before, in the federal government, in the Congress, you have people from each state. But now that the South just left and, do we reintroduce the South back into the federal government, or is it only going to be Northerners?
And what will the dimensions of black freedom be?
And lastly, black freedom. Like, how free are the blacks really? How much right do we give them, right? Now that slavery is abolished, what do we do with them? Do we send them back to, Africa? Do we make them citizens? Do we make them our equal? What is it going to be? Racial question. The 3 big questions of Reconstruction and the aftermaths of Civil War.
All eyes looked to Washington. Former Confederates held their breath and steeled themselves for the worst.
The South doesn't know what to expect. Will there be punishment for leaders? Will there be land confiscated? Will there be an occupying army? And a lot of people imagine that these traitors, these people who have tried to destroy the United States, should be executed, should be imprisoned.
No one was sure what to expect from the new president. Andrew Johnson.
So another big question is, what do we do with the traitors of the South, the people who left the nation and started the war? And what do we do with them? Do we kill them? Do we imprison them? Do we do nothing? And what about all the land in the South? Right? How is the South going to be punished? And this was up to the next president, which was Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, honestly, not the greatest guy ever. A very terrible guy. He was a Southerner, so he didn't really punish them that badly. All he required them to do was for the South to say, I'm sorry. Like, to admit that they lost. Say, I'm sorry, we lost. If they admitted they were lost, they were forgiven. That was it. But he was more focused on how do we make sure that the blacks aren't equals as the whites, and number 2, how do we punish the rich guys down in the South?
Was from Tennessee, but he had fiercely opposed the Confederate secession and was the only Southern senator who refused to give up his seat in Congress.
Andrew Johnson embodies a lot of the hopes that Abraham Lincoln has that the Union can be put back together easily. But Andrew Johnson had been an outspoken enemy of the big planners who he blamed for causing secession. In Tennessee politics, he saw himself as a spokesman for the poor whites. He owned a slave.
So he thought that the big reason that, the secession happened was because of the planters, the planter class, the rich guys who owned plantations in the South. And he was one with the poor people in the South, right? He sympathized with them. And he was a very big opposer when the secession happened. He was a Southerner, but he didn't want the South to secede, right?
Or two, but he was not a member of the plantation aristocracy. In fact, he resented them very much.
In his first speech after taking office, Johnson warned that traitors had to be punished. But Johnson shared the white South's desire to keep blacks subordinate. Frederick Douglass, the renowned black leader, got his own impression.
So Frederick Douglass, when he met Johnson, he knew that Johnson was not an ally of black people.
Of Johnson when the two met for the first time at Lincoln's second inaugural.
The very first expression that came over Johnson's face was one of scorn and derision, and Douglass concluded that that expression was the true index of his heart. Douglass turned to a companion and said, "Whatever else this man may be, he is no friend of our race."
Even as Lee surrendered to Grant, scores of newly emancipated men and women were arriving at St. Catharines in the Sea Islands of Georgia. Under Sherman's Field Order 15, these abandoned lands would be theirs. Leading them was 53-year-old Tunis G. Campbell from New Jersey. For years, Campbell had worked tirelessly as an abolitionist, a preacher, an educator, and political organizer. With the help of Secretary of War Stanton, Campbell got himself appointed superintendent for the Union-occupied islands in Georgia.
There are a lot of people in 1865 who are trying to tell blacks what freedom is and tell them what they ought to be doing. Campbell reflects the impulse we should really determine ourselves what we're doing. Independence from white control, that's critical to their definition of what freedom is. It just happens that on St. Catharines Island, you can create such a thing. The whites have all fled, Sherman has given out land, so the opportunity to create an independent black community exists.
We left with rations at a few families, and at Hilton Head got more, Campbell wrote. And Savannah loaded us as deep as we could swim. These deserted lands.
So Tunis Campbell, next guy that you have to know about, right? Tunis Campbell was a black guy. He was a slave before, and after, they won the war with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Special Order 15. They received some land in the Sea Islands in St. Catherine Island, right? And over there they set up a community with exclusively only black people. Right.
Had been at the heart of the South's rice-growing empire.
As Campbell arrived to the island and they put the gangplank down, the island was overgrown. It's been looted by Union naval forces. The seagrass is high. There are rattlesnakes. There are alligators. He can see the slave cabins. They're also in great disrepair. Immediately upon arriving and assessing the situation there, he writes to the American Missionary Association, asking for seed, asking for plows, sweet potatoes to supplement the diet, marriage licenses for the people. And he calls a meeting of the people to explain to them, this is our home. Beginning next week, I will divide up the land into 40 acres for each of you.
By June, the settlers had crops in the ground. I have corn, watermelons, citron, onions, radishes, and squash, wrote Campbell. But the rebels have destroyed the sweet potatoes. Do not fail to send them. Send 8 number 11 plows, 6 cultivators. Get the improved ones.
Tunis Campbell sees the South as a kind of new political frontier. Sees himself as a kind of political pioneer to go to that place where this new regime of black political liberty and civil liberty might flourish.
Campbell arrived at St. Catharines with his own blueprint for a government. There would be a Congress with 8 men in the Senate and 20 in the House of Representatives, a Supreme Court, and Campbell himself as president. He even established a 275-man militia. Order, said Campbell, is heaven's first law.
So you've got this tiny little island, 12 miles long, 3 miles wide, and a government set up to resemble the United States government with the Supreme Court at the top. It's wonderful, beautiful experiment in democracy, and people took to it very well. They liked the idea of having the power to select their leaders and remove them.
But at St. Catharines, no one was going to remove Tunis Campbell. That same fall, 9 black soldiers and their white captain climbed aboard a sternwheeler in New Orleans and headed upriver. The captain, Marshal Twitchell, was a career soldier from Vermont who had led black troops during the war. He had fought at Antietam, Fredericksburg.
Okay, so before, Marshal Twitchell, let's talk about Tunis Campbell for a little bit. You guys should know that he started a own government, just like the Congress had had a Supreme Court, even a 275 men military, and it was all black. It's just a symbolism that black people were able to run their own thing, do their own thing without any white person telling them what to do. Even though that might seem completely obvious now that black people can, lead themselves. Back then, a lot of people didn't believe that. And Tunis Campbell was a good example to prove them wrong.
The Wilderness, and just about every other major battle in the East.
Twitchell is one of those Union veterans who enlist in the first year of the war and stays the duration. He's wounded several times. He gets a mini ball right in his face. It cuts a groove around his face and exits behind his ear. He'll have the scar for the rest of his life.
The war was over, and Twitchell was restless. In New Orleans, he got himself a commission in the Freedmen's Bureau. In the chaotic post-war South, the job of the Freedmen's Bureau agent was to smooth the transition from slavery to freedom.
Okay, so Marshal Twitchell, right? Very important guy. He appears in both of the documentaries. This is where he first appears. He was a soldier who started at the very beginning of the Civil War and fought in most of the major battles in I guess every major battle in the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, he was like, what do I do now? Since his accomplishments and everything he's done basically in his life that was notable was in the army. Now that the war was over, he felt like he had no more purpose. And that's why he found himself at the Freedmen's Bureau, because during the war, he had led a lot of black troops in battle. So he had a long history with an extensive, deep relationship with the black people. So he worked at the Freedmen's Bureau, and as you can see, the Freedmen's Bureau's purpose is to smooth the transition from slavery to freedom for black people, right? Because if you were a slave, how can you learn how to have a life? And this is how you go to the Freedmen's Bureau.
The Bureau built schools for the former slaves and fed and clothed war refugees, black and white. Twitchell was posted to Bienville Parish in northern Louisiana, a place.
So this is a place, Bienville Parish in northern Louisiana, and this place is very, very, very countryside. And the problem is this place, the North never really came here and fought them, right? The war was just ended. And for Bienville Parish in northern Louisiana, they never thought the war was lost. They never thought it was over. And because of that, what happened is very dangerous. If you have a northerner coming down here, especially working for the Freedmen's Bureau, and they hear that you want to re-educate and help the freedmen, oh man, your life is in big danger.
He knew nothing about.
Here he is on a sternwheeler heading up the Red River. This region had never been conquered, so he's entering the last part of the Confederacy to surrender. It is dangerous, exotic, it's isolated, and he doesn't know it, but he is entering what is probably the most violent place in America. It's no coincidence that Harriet Beecher Stowe chose to put the final brutal ending of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Uncle Tom is beaten to death by Simon Legree. It's no coincidence that she puts it on the upper Red River. It's a violent region.
I was without telegraphy, railway, or water connections, remembered Twitchell. If I'd known beforehand what my position was to be, I should have remained with my regiment. At the courthouse in Sparta, the county seat, Captain Twitchell set up office as the sole Freedmen's Bureau agent for the parish. He soon discovered his new neighbors were as hardened to battle as he was.
My great-grandfather had 2 brothers killed in the war and another wounded, and I'm named after one of them. there wasn't a family here that didn't lose somebody to the war. But in our little area, these veterans were never defeated. And that is a lot of the feeling here. The war just ended, and so everybody went home. And up into the midst of this came Twitchell.
Yeah, so what this guy is saying is basically, you know, like I said, a lot of these like soldiers in the South, they were fighting the war and suddenly they just lost. But then the North never came to their specific area. So, I mean, I guess they were done, but they never felt that they lost because they never fought directly, right? So you can imagine if a Northerner comes down and then says that they won, they can say like, no, you didn't. And then they will fight them, and it's very dangerous.
The people in the area are wary. They don't quite know what to expect. But they quickly discover that this Freedmen's Bureau agent is somebody that they're going to have to deal with.
Agents like Twitchell had military authority to settle labor disputes and conflicts between former slaves and masters.
The planters certainly resented this intrusion into so sensitive an area. They wanted direct control over black laborers. They didn't want some Yankee Freedmen's Bureau agent there questioning their behavior, actually sitting them down and having them testify. And for the freedmen, here was somebody that they could go to if they were mistreated. You can't fundamentally change the economic lives of these people.
So, important point here, he can't fundamentally change the economic lives of these people. So a lot of these like previously slaves and now freedmen, they still had to work at the farm and plantations because just Marshall Twitchell and the Bureau himself, even though he has the support of the federal army, it's not enough to completely, you know, free everyone and be like, okay, you don't need to do shit now. And they still like very heavily oppressed many of the freedmen. And that's because this South area is too overrun with racist Southerners, and they will not give up no matter what. So it's a hard balance between, you know, where do I draw the line of, you know, like where do I draw the line of, yeah, they have their rights, but at the same time, if I enforce that right too much, I'm gonna get killed.
All I can do is try to be a mediator, to give them some degree of justice.
Twitchell would soon learn that for a Yankee officer all alone in Northwest Louisiana, even a degree of federal justice might be too much. For the first 48 days of Andrew Johnson's presidency, Southerners waited anxiously to hear what he would demand before allowing them back into the Union. On May 29, 1865, Johnson announced his plan for what would be called Presidential Reconstruction.
There was good evidence in 1865 that a lot of white Southerners, leadership even of the Confederacy, would have accepted relatively harsh policies at that moment. But very soon it became clear that Andrew Johnson wanted a rapid, lenient restoration of the Union with as little alteration of the Constitution and the creation of black civil and political rights as possible.
Johnson would issue blanket pardons for most former Confederates.
Okay, so here is pretty shocking. So what Andrew Johnson did, like after the war, the Confederate lost, and they knew that they lost, and they were ready. They were ready to receive punishments that were very harsh because they knew that what they did is not something that's, you know, like a small thing. They knew it wasn't trivial. They knew it was a serious mistake that they had made, and they were ready to receive punishment. But Andrew Johnson walks in the White House. He walks in the White House, and he's like, you know what? Actually, I'm gonna change as little as possible on the South, right? So Reconstruction, basically, like very little Reconstruction on the South, and I will, try as hard as I can to not let the blacks have any rights. So what he did here, he gave blanket pardons. Basically, if the president pardons someone, it's a power that the president has. So if, let's say that, I committed a crime and I'm in jail. If the president wants to pardon me, he can. So what that means is just that he can say that I'm no longer, guilty. I'm not in jail. And he doesn't really need a reason. That's just a presidential pardon. So he did that shit to a lot of the former Confederate members and freed them.
Rebel states would be encouraged to form new governments quickly. Washington would not interfere. The president's leniency surprised many in the North. Southerners responded with relief.
Johnson actually sets only the most minimal requirements. All they have to do is admit, we lost the Civil War. The Civil War is over. Slavery and secession are dead. Other than that, there are no requirements.
Yeah, so you can see that's very lenient. He said the only requirement is to say, hey, man, we admit that we lost. And number two, we agree that slavery is no longer. That's it. That's all that they had to do. But for the plantation owners, that's a different story.
Johnson was harder on the planter aristocracy. He insisted that wealthy planters and Confederate leaders write him personally and beg for clemency.
This basically eliminates the planter class from leadership of Southern politics. If you're not pardoned, you can't vote, you can't hold office, and you can't get your property back if it's been seized by the federal government.
Andrew Johnson had no sympathy for wealthy planters. He had risen from poverty and identified with poor white Southerners who, before the war, had far outnumbered the slave owners. Now, he was anxious to protect poor whites from what they saw as a new threat.
Okay, so, like I said before, what Andrew Johnson required the Southern plantation owners to do is to write a personal letter to beg for forgiveness, for a pardon. And without that pardon, they were basically like, they don't have citizenship, they can't get their land back, they can't vote, they can't like participate in office, they can't do any of that. So they basically had no power, right?
Poor whites have to face the fact that now that black people are free means that they have to compete with this new element for livelihoods, for social positions, and for political power ultimately. And this is a very frightening thing.
Johnson's aim is to bring the white South and the white North back together. African Americans just do not play a role in Johnson's vision of the post-war South other than to go back to work and be landless and rightless plantation laborers.
Johnson's contempt for the freedmen infuriated many in Washington, and none more than Thaddeus Stevens. The congressman from Pennsylvania had been a fierce abolitionist long before the war. Within the Republican Party, he led a small, vocal faction known as the Radicals.
These were principled men. Before the war, they had been the strongest Republicans opposing the expansion of slavery. During the Civil War, they had been the first ones to call for arming of black troops, for issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. Long before there was any conceivable political benefit to be gained from supporting the rights of black people, they were doing it.
So the radical Republicans are the real, like, supporters for, like, abolition of black slavery, right? As you can see, as you just heard, they supported, you know, abolition of black slavery before there was any benefit for political, you know, gains, when it was unpopular. They were the first ones to call for Reconstruction. They were the first ones to call for Emancipation Proclamation before anyone else. And Thaddeus Stevens is like a leader in the radical Republican.
The radical Republicans had a vision of what Reconstruction should be. They believed it should be longer in duration. They believed the Southern states had left the Union and had destroyed their status as states. They had to be reinvented. To Thaddeus Stevens, Reconstruction meant not only safeguarding and preserving the essential results of the Civil War, but in his vision, it meant remaking the South. It meant the increase of democracy in terms of representation. It meant the spread of the right of suffrage.
So Reconstruction meant different things for different people. For Andrew Johnson, as you saw, it was a quick and basically non-existent thing, right? Reconstruction, let's reconstruct the South. You apologize, you're wrong, and you lost, and also no more slavery. Done. But radical Republicans realize that that's not going to really protect the rights of the blacks, because if you don't really reinvent the South and make sure that they, you know, treat the blacks better with more, you know, suffrage, like here saying, like more rights and better representation, like votings, everything, then you're going to go back to the same system as before. So radical Republicans wanted a longer, more looked at Reconstruction for the South.
The Radicals' hard line marginalized them within their own party. Most Republicans feared the Radicals' position on black rights would drive away white voters in the North.
It is the radical wing which is the most sympathetic to black people. The party in general was committed to a limited program of civil rights, protection of property, education, etc. But the party is not in any way committed to any sort of radical restructuring of Southern society.
Johnson's Reconstruction Plan could not be challenged until Congress convened in December. That summer, radical leaders could only watch as scores of planters descended on Washington, pleading to be pardoned. Whose petition would be denied or granted was uncertain. Still, former Confederates were hopeful. White men alone, President Johnson told one senator, must manage the South. On St. Catherine's Island, Tunis Campbell's Township was flourishing. 369 settlers occupied 54 slave dwellings left from the old days. They grew fruits and vegetables of all kinds. But what they wanted were schools. There is one sin that slavery committed against me that I will never forgive, remembered one man. It robbed me of my education.
Before the Civil War, maybe no more than 10 to 15% of the black population of the South was literate. To learn how to read was a revolutionary act. They understood that it was necessary, if they were to take their place as free people within the Union, that they have the rudiments of education to survive.
After the war, freedmen who had secretly educated themselves quickly opened schools in warehouses, on barges, even in old slave markets. And the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern missionaries built thousands more throughout the South.
Okay, so pretty important here. Tunis Campbell, we go back to his his experiment with his own government system, right? Based on democracy, and it was going well, but they wanted schools, and education is something that's really important to know, because it's another step that the South took to differentiate between the black and the whites, right? Being able to read is very much a human thing to do, and preventing the blacks from being able to read just makes them more savage and less alike the whites. That's why the whites in the South didn't want black people to be able to read. But then afterwards, black people wanted to have an education, because it's important for people to have educations and for them to be more equal towards the white. And that's what they did. Freedmen's Bureau helped a lot, and people who had learned secretly or it was part of the slave job, learned how to read, quickly opened up schools to help everyone else to become literate.
At St. Catherine's, Campbell used his own savings to bring teachers down from the north. Then he called on his wife, Harriet, in New York.
He writes a letter to Harriet, says, bring the sons down, we're going to establish the schools, we're on an island of our own, there are no white people here, and we're going to lift up children. Bring all the primers you have, and please join us. It's the first time he's seen his wife and sons in about 2 years.
Harriet and Tunis taught side by side with northern teachers. Campbell reported that 80 children and adults on St. Catherine's and 60 on nearby Sapelo Island were enrolled in schools. More than 1,000 students attended Campbell's makeshift academies.
The adults are being taught at night. They need to deal with white people more as equals. And to do that, they have to be literate.
White planters watching from the mainland resented the schools and the entire settlement, not just because the land had been seized from one of their own, but because of Campbell's ambition and independence.
People like Campbell were viewed as black people out of their place. He can think for himself in ways that whites find it hard to believe that a black person could think. This means, then, that history has somehow spun out of control.
By June 1865, Jacob Waldberg, the white planter who had owned St. Catherine's, was back in Georgia. He demanded that Campbell get off his land.
The planters are holding up deeds to the islands that are 200 years old or 150 years old. They said, no, wait a minute, this is a nation of laws, and see, my great-granddaddy had this deed. And yours comes from a possessory title given to you in time of war for abandoned lands. How does that affect my promise of property rights under the Constitution of the United States?
Okay, so this is, up until this point, we can see there's a very, positive, everything's pretty positive for blacks. I mean, except for the Andrew Johnson shit. But this is when the white people kind of started to strike back. And so all the Georgia lands and the Sea Islands property that was taken away from the government based on Special Order 15, it was temporary because, white Southerners argued, hey, look, I have a piece of paper here. proving my right to property on this land. And right to property, this is in the Constitution, right? My right to own my land, and it's from the federal government. So your little piece of shit like order doesn't do anything, because my paper proving that I have ownership to this land supersedes or overcomes, is higher than your little order. So they started to take their land back, and it worked, unfortunately, since Andrew Johnson was racist and he was approving of all of this.
Wahlberg got his answer. St. Catherine's Congress passed a law forbidding any white person from setting foot on the island. Campbell's militia stood ready to enforce it.
And because they were trying to take their land back, Campbell passed the law in his own little government that white people are not able to enter the islands, and he took his army and ready to fight back and destroy them. However, you'll learn that something unexpected happens, and then they had to give up their land.
At home again, but so many changes. It does not seem the same place. The bare echoing rooms, the neglect and defacement of all. Gardens, orchard, and fences are mostly swept away. Nothing is left but to endure.
When Kate Stone and her mother returned to their Louisiana home after the war, they were nearly bankrupt. There was no credit to be had. Of the 150 slaves they had owned, only a few remained at Broken Burn. The Stones had safeguarded the family's silver before their escape. Now, it was a reminder of the wealth and position the family had lost. What the women mourned most were the men who had sacrificed themselves for the Southern cause.
Many white Southerners find themselves facing, as Kate Stone does, a defeat that has taken the lives of her brothers and her uncle and so many of the people she's known. When Kate's oldest brother, who is not killed in the war, comes back, he hardly speaks, she says, for many months after his return. This was a civilization in which 3 out of 4 men of military age served. Many of them were in the war for years on end. How could we not expect that that experience and defeat and slaughter and tragedy would have left them, in some sense, wounded?
All these hundreds of thousands of Confederate soldiers are going back home, uncertain of what they're going to find and uncertain of what they're going to do. As they look around and see the free black people refusing to just do what white men tell them to do and trying to create freedom for their families, everything looks to them as an insult and as a threat. White Southerners say, we've got to make clear who's boss. We've got to make clear that we are in control of all of this.
In Washington, President Johnson shared white Southerners' concerns over growing black independence in the South.
Johnson is seeing a black population who have abandoned the plantations, people who are demanding that they be treated in a decent fashion. And Johnson believes they should return to their former places of work, and above all, should accept their subordination to white power and authority.
Andrew Johnson believes there's going to be a reconciliation between North and South. There's going to be a reconciliation of white Northerners and white Southerners. And if black people have to be set aside, fine.
The president abandoned his strict policy toward the planters. By fall of 1865, he was pardoning so many that special clerks had to be hired to keep up with the paperwork.
Okay, so with people like Tunis Campbell, gaining position of power and gaining more independence and influence over the South, Andrew Johnson, along with millions of other Southerners, become concerned that they were gonna have to treat the blacks in a semi-respectable way. So Andrew Johnson's like, all right, that's too much. I'm gonna do something that to help with the process make sure that the blacks don't get too much power. So what Andrew Johnson did, remember when I told you that rich plantation farmers and they had to write special letters, like a personal letter to approve to Andrew Johnson for him to have a chance at giving them pardons. So he decided to approve every single one without even looking, and he was approving hundreds and thousands of them. and he was approving them so fast that he had to hire someone to approve them. And with all of these approving of like the apology letters, right? What happened? The southern plantation owners got their plantations back, and they went and took back the lands that was now occupied by black people. And the black people, most of them lost their land. And what did they have to do? They had to work back at the same place because they had nowhere else to go. And that's exactly what Andrew Johnson wanted.
Johnson thinks that only the planters can really keep these African Americans under control. So very quickly he begins to bring the wealthy planters back into his Reconstruction policy in order to really impose subordination on the former slaves.
The planters only want to be pardoned so that they can get their land back. And so Andrew Johnson complies with their wishes, pardoning 15,000 to 20,000 planters, hundreds of them being pardoned every day. When these planters then are pardoned, they return to their islands and to their acreages all over the South, and they want the people who are then living there removed.
The president ordered that Confederate lands seized by Union troops during the war be returned to the planters, including land confiscated under General Sherman's Field Order 15. In Georgia, the assistant commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau refused to give planters back their land. Johnson fired him and replaced him with someone who would.
Do you hear that? Freedmen's Bureau said, "Hey, you're not able to do that. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't give the lands back to the white people. The black people here, they deserve these lands." And then Andrew Johnson's like, "You know what? Who do you work for again? That's right, bitch. You work for me, and I'm gonna fire you." So he did. He fired him, and then he's like, "Who wants to work for the new vice president position and approves of my, removal of these black people from the lands?" And then someone filled in, and he continued his rampage.
In Washington, the head of the Bureau, General O.O. Howard, sympathized with the freedmen and resisted the president's decree for as long as he could. Finally, in October, Howard set out for the black settlement at Edisto Island off the coast of South Carolina. His orders from President Johnson were to effect an agreement mutually satisfactory to the freedmen and the landowners. Behind the bureaucratic language, Johnson's directive was clear.
General Howard has to tell these former slaves that the land that they thought had been given to them by the federal government now is going to be given back to the former owners. And if they want to remain there, they're going to have to sign labor contracts to work as laborers on these plantations. These people believe that they have a right to this land. To them, this is a violation, a deep betrayal of the promises that the government made to them. They are not willing to just take this line down.
I've endeavored to explain the wishes of the president, and with one voice they cried, "No, no." In the noise and confusion, a sweet-voiced Negro woman began the hymn, "Nobody knows the trouble I feel. Nobody knows but Jesus."
All right, so what's happened here? General Howard is a good guy, right? He feels bad for the freedmen, and what? He feels...
Many had been following events.
Sorry, he feels very bad for the freedmen. He tried to resist Andrew Johnson's orders, but he was unsuccessful. And he had to break their hearts and tell them, you know what, I can't give you this land. You can't retain them. You can't keep the land. And if you want to stay here, you'll have to work at the plantations as which is just another way of saying you're going to be basically a slave again, except you're going to be paid nothing, almost nothing. And you're going to be exposed to horrible working conditions once more.
In Washington, and insisted they would wait and see what Congress had to say. Others petitioned Howard in writing. Wrote one man, "You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island. The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, and will not let me stay in his empty hut, except I will do his planting and be satisfied with his pride."
But that kind of
Got to make clear who's boss. We've got to make clear that we are in control of all of this.
Oh no, Cat.
That man, I cannot well forgive.
Oh.
In January 1866, a large contingent of black soldiers arrived at St. Catharines with orders to restore the land to Jacob Wahlberg. Campbell's militia had kept whites off the island, but this was something different.
So, like I said before, you might remember I said Campbell was ready to kill anybody who stepped onto the island, but something unexpected happened. What is it? Well, Andrew Johnson, that bitch, like if white people weren't working, he recruited black soldiers to take away the land. Imagine that.
Dennis Campbell believed that the people had to take things into their own hands sometimes. But African-American freed men are not going to fire on African-American soldiers. No.
The experiment in independence at St. Catharines was over. A determined Tunis Campbell headed for the Georgia mainland. In Louisiana, black farmers had leased over 10,000 acres from the Freedmen's Bureau, believing they would soon own them outright. Marshall Twitchell and other Freedmen's Bureau agents delivered a different message. No matter what they'd heard, no 40 acres and a mule was coming from this government.
This is what presidential Reconstruction is coming to me, is telling the freedmen that the government is not going to pamper you. The government is not going to give you any land. You have a hard row ahead of you. Get used to it.
Freedom from slavery, Twitchell informed black laborers, is not freedom from work. His words reflected worries shared by whites north and south, that freed African Americans would not work and would refuse to go back to the cotton fields.
What would then happen to the cotton crop of the South? Northern industry needs that cotton. It's still the largest exporter of the United States. To earn foreign money, you need to export cotton. Northerners were not willing to let blacks stop growing cotton.
So you see, the reality of the situation is, no matter how much the North feels bad for, slaves, they still had a paycheck to run, which means that if the black people, the slaves, aren't planting the cotton, who the hell is, right? Somebody has to plant the cotton, because without the cotton, no one's making money, and there's going to be a terrible economic situation coming up. So the North is like, you know what? Now you're not slaves. Just be a laborer, be a worker, and work back at the farm. So they actually like that a lot.
Freedmen, I think, probably would have chosen to duck out of the cotton economy altogether. You can't eat cotton. For freedmen, becoming an independent landowner is a dream. That's their version of the American dream. But that kind of independence for freedmen, Southern planters don't want it, the Freedmen's Bureau doesn't want it, many Northerners in Congress don't want it.
Across Louisiana, white planters now sat down to draw up labor contracts with the men they used to own.
No matter what color your skin is, no matter what your status before the war had been, it's a new order for everybody. No matter what happens politically, you've got to figure out how you're going to feed yourself and your family. That's the backbeat. That's the rhythm of which everything else depends.
So, important point here. After the Civil War, not only were the black slaves, like freedmen, finding work, they're like, how can I free myself now that I'm free? The white Southern plantation owners, they were also scratching their head, wondering what they're gonna do, because they don't have free slaves now. What are they gonna do? They have to employ somebody, and as you can see here, because of Andrew Johnson, a lot of times the same exact slaves came back as workers, but they had to write contracts, right? Like make out a deal between the two where both of them would agree to work. But the black freedmen needed the job more than the plantation owners needed the black freedmen, because the freedman has nothing, while the plantation owners still had something. So the wage, the money that they were getting paid was super, super low. And the conditions of working conditions were also terrible as well. But they had no choice but to accept it.
The freed people understand that they're going to have to work, but they do not want someone riding around on a horse with a whip curled on his shoulder, as the overseer had done under slavery. And they also do not want to work for low wages.
For many white Southerners, negotiating with slaves seemed unimaginable. because in the very notion of negotiation is an assumption of some kind of equality. And for many white Southerners, they don't have anything to pay them with because they themselves are on the verge of desperation.
There is now nothing between me and the nigger but the dollar, the almighty dollar, said one South Carolina planter. And I shall make out of him the most I can at the least expense.
They want submissive, obedient employees. I think in their heart of hearts, they want a system that is as close to slavery as possible.
Black laborers who insisted on better wages and working conditions were regularly met with threats and violence. Vigilantes lynched whole families and used the bullwhip on men and women as they had in slavery days. In 1865, more than 2,000 black men, women, and children were reported murdered in Louisiana alone.
The violence in the South was a way to reestablish white supremacy.
These gangs that whites pick out, the guy is trying to save his money. He's trying to get ahead. A man who is an inspiration to other black people in the community. He's the one that gets murdered. It amounts to systematic culling of alpha males from the black community.
So, all this to say that in the South, they needed to establish that white supremacy was still here and that the blacks ain't shit. So they ended up killing all of any potential black person who had any kind of charismatic traits or a following from other black people, shutting down their leaders, which leaves the rest of the black people, hopefully, they thought, hopefully to, leave them in despair and just give up and be obedient to the whites again.
The Southern legal system became an instrument of intimidation. Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida passed laws that virtually prohibited freedmen from any work except as field hands. The laws were called Black Codes.
So Black Codes are a remodeling of slave codes, and there are state laws in the South that prohibited the black people from working anywhere. And also other things like, if you're unemployed, like if you don't have a job as a black person, then you can be sent to jail. Or if you're, if you have, if you're not working really well, then yeah, you can be sent to jail. If you insult someone, usually a white person, you can be sent to jail. Either jail or the other system is a laborer. Right? In the prisoner, our prison's obsolete reading, we learn that the Black Codes, if you are punished, you can either be sent to jail or you can be sent as a contract labor, which is even worse than slavery in some cases.
The aim was slavery without the chain.
The Black Codes were laws passed to control and restrict and constrain the lives of the freed people, essentially rendering them bondsmen again under law.
Some states made it illegal for freedmen to handle weapons and restricted them from buying or renting land. Black children could be seized from poor families and forced to work in the fields. If a black man had no job, he could be jailed and auctioned to a planter for his labor.
They make a travesty of the freedom that African Americans have acquired. They are so far from any notion of fairness or freedom that even Northerners who are not egalitarians say these laws are unacceptable. And so Northern Republicans are faced with a dilemma. They don't want to have a big fight with the president, but to accept the idea that Johnson's policy is a success and accept the Black Codes, they feel means giving up the victory in the Civil War.
To Louisiana's black veterans, one freedman offered this advice: I would say to every colored soldier, bring your gun home. By early 1866, Marshall Twitchell was feeling pressure from the locals who resented his authority. Soon, another distraction made his life even more complicated. Adele Coleman was just 20 years old. She was spirited, intelligent, and much admired by local bachelors. Adele and Marshall became daily companions, but their romance was troubled from the start. Scandalized by their daughter's suitor, Adele's parents forbade her to see the Yankee officer. when she tried to continue the affair in secret, Adele's brother, Gus, a Confederate veteran, set out to hunt Twitchell down. One evening, a stranger came calling on Twitchell, unannounced.
Marshall goes walking outside. He's ready to blow this person away. And then, when the person speaks, he hears Adele's voice. It is Adele in disguise. She has come to warn him that her brother Gus is out gunning for him. He, of course, is not going to let her ride home alone. The trip takes 2.5 to 3 hours. It takes Marshall and Adele this particular night, all night. Adele comes marching in with the morning sun, and the Coleman household just goes berserk, ballistic. Twitchell has gotten himself into the position, whether he fully realizes it or not, he's either going to marry her or they're going to kill him.
Not everyone in northern Louisiana believed marriage was the honorable solution.
A Southern girl following the Civil War, they were no men. There were no men to marry. But for goodness sake, they couldn't marry a Yankee. And Adele Coleman did. But a lot of members of her own family didn't like the fact that she married a Northerner, and especially one in a position of power that he was in.
6 months after their wedding, Marshall and Adele settled on a 420-acre plantation overlooking Lake Bispino. It was as much an alliance as it was a marriage.
It opens up possibilities for the Colemans. It opens up possibilities for him. Here is, in a sense, the opportunity to become wealthy much quicker than he had ever anticipated. The Colemans teach Marshall Twitchell about growing cotton, and he teaches them about Yankee business enterprise.
Everybody in the South was broke, and I think that he came to enrich himself. And if that helps somebody, then fine. And if it hurts somebody, that's the spoils of war.
In December 1865, the 39th Congress, the first since the end of the Civil War, convened in Washington. More than 60 former Confederates prepared to take their seats, including 4 generals, 4 colonels, and 6 Confederate cabinet officers.
Okay, so after the Civil War, there was a Congress meeting that basically decided what the next, what the future, like who was going to be the next Congress member. And so all the ex-Confederate in the South, they're like, give me my position back. I want my position in the federal government now that we're in the same country. But obviously that's very controversial because a lot of Northerners thought that they don't deserve to be in the government since they were the ones who started, who left the country in the first place.
Even Alexander H. Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, expecting, as one observer put it, to govern the country he had been trying to destroy.
If the South was going to rise again, so to speak, control its own political life, control the freed people, indeed, if ex-Confederates themselves were going to be allowed back into leadership at the national level, then to so many white Northerners it seemed like the war would have been fought in vain.
On the opening day, the clerk of the House refused to announce the names of the Southern delegates in his roll call. The former Confederates were denied their elected seats and sent packing.
So what ended up happening is the North refused to recognize them as delegates or potential people to, be in the seat of Congress, and they were sent home.
The fight for control of Reconstruction had begun.
In many ways, Congress was a poisoned atmosphere in the debates over the Reconstruction policy. There were raw war memories being played out. There were visceral hatreds being played out on the floor of Congress between Republicans and Democrats. These debates are between men who have experienced this war, who have fought this war. They are fighting literally about the meaning of that conflict they have just fought.
Northern Democrats sided with Johnson and railed against Republicans across the aisle. Washington must get out of the way, they insisted, and let Southerners run their own affairs.
The Democrats had always identified themselves as the party of the white man. They very explicitly said, we are here to protect the rights of white men, North and South. And how do we do that? We hold the Union together. For that reason, the Democrats saw themselves as trying to put North and South together as quickly as possible during the Civil War, and as soon as it's over, trying to knit North and South together at the expense of black men.
At one point in the debate, Thaddeus Stevens stood up and, answering his Democratic colleagues, says, "Do not, I pray you, admit those who have slaughtered 500,000 of our countrymen until their clothes are dried and until they are reclad. I do not wish to sit side by side with men whose garments smell of the blood of my kindred." It was Stevens' way of saying, we're going to keep the South out of the Union as long as we can, and we're not going to allow anybody back in here who was responsible for making the war.
A congressional committee on Reconstruction concluded that Southern governments were unable to keep law and order or stem violence against African Americans. Allowing Southern states unchecked power so soon after the war, the committee said, was madness and lunacy. Moderate Republicans had hoped to persuade Johnson to provide minimal protections for blacks in the South. Now, even they were growing impatient with the president's policies. In March 1866.
Okay, so what happened here? Radical Republican leaders such as Thaddeus Stevens, like, no way in hell Southern Confederates is gonna run the country, right? They're gonna drive what we did so hard to win the war and what we represent. They're gonna just destroy it all, right? They're gonna undo all the progress. While, you know, Southerners, like previous Confederacy members, wanted the control and a seat in the government because they wanted to be able to shape their own future in the South. They didn't want the North to tell the South what they needed to do, right? So it was a fierce battle. Kind of like the documentary said, people in the Congress were reliving the war because many of the people in the meeting, the North and the South, they know that each other, they know like their friends who has been killed by friends or family that had been killed by the other side.
Both houses of Congress passed a landmark civil rights bill that protected the rights of American citizens without regard to race. Republicans warned Johnson not to veto the bill if he hoped for any continued cooperation with Congress. 2 weeks later, Johnson vetoed the civil rights bill.
So the Republicans passed the bill, right, civil rights bill, in 1866, right, civil rights bill of 1866, that's to give like citizenship to everybody, no matter what the race of a person is. But for, you know, the legislative branch, like the Republican Congress, for the bill to be actually like true, the president had to agree on it. And they warned the president, hey man, don't you veto meaning like they deny the bill. Don't you dare deny the bill, because if you do, then, you know, there's no way in hell you're going to be a president again, and our relationship between the Congress and the president is going to be doomed. And Andrew Johnson said, fuck off, I'm going to veto the bill. So the bill was vetoed.
Johnson is opposed to the granting of those types of protections to black people. This had not been done for the white immigrants who had come to America. Why then are you doing it for these black people?
Moderate Republicans were outraged.
Johnson was stubborn, self-righteous, rigid in thinking. He was really the worst person possible to become president accidentally at a time when flexibility, vision, and creative leadership were really what was required.
Moderate Republicans are forced into the radical camp because they had to oppose Andrew Johnson. Johnson's plan of Reconstruction was so lenient, in utter contempt of black liberty, that was simply unacceptable.
A united Republican Party overrode Johnson's veto. America had its first Civil Rights Act.
Okay, so basically, even though Johnson vetoed the bill, like that veto angered every single Republican, not only the radical Republicans, right? All the Republicans, even the moderate ones, which is the majority of the Congress, and they denied Andrew Johnson's veto and passed it anyways.
But many in Congress argued that the act was not enough, that safeguarding civil rights required changes to the Constitution itself. Republican leaders proposed a new amendment.
The 14th Amendment becomes the crux of the political battle in 1866. And basically, what they put into the Constitution is a new definition of American nationality and citizenship, making African Americans for the first time full citizens of the United States. This is the origin of the concept of civil rights in American society. Rights which obtain to you as a citizen, which cannot be rescinded because of your race.
This is a titanic debate about just what the authority of the federal government is going to be. There were plenty of Americans who argued the federal government had no right to declare black people citizens.
So after the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, made it law, the Congress here now wants another amendment, and ensure, on top of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, they wanted part of the Constitution that no matter what the race, everyone born in the United States would be considered citizens.
Democrats are constantly putting forward racist arguments. You are eradicating a line between black and white which has existed forever. To Republicans, what's at stake here really is the definition of freedom. If a person can be discriminated against in every walk of life because of their race, has slavery really been abolished?
And for Democrats, I mean, it's an act against God. They argue that God created like black and whites in a different way. You cannot make them equal by the Constitution. You don't have the power to do that. And the Republicans thought that, you know, they worked so hard to win the war to abolish slavery and put it in the Constitution. But if they're not equal and a citizen, what good is the abolishment of slavery? It's like, it's useless. So that's why they fought so hard to protect the rights of blacks.
Congress overwhelmingly passed the 14th Amendment, but it had to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The president denounced the amendment and accused the Republicans of treason.
Johnson is opposed to an expansion of federal power. For him, constitutional authority resides at the state level, not at the national level. And Johnson believes that the Republicans are engaged in an enormous usurpation of state authority.
The lines were drawn.
So what that means is that Johnson thought that power of the government comes from the states, and the states had to pass the amendment, and that's, you know, the Republican didn't have the power to do that.
Since the end of the war, black political conventions had been taking place across the South. The central issue was black suffrage. We simply ask that we be recognized as men, declared the South Carolina Convention of Colored People, that the same laws which govern over white men shall govern black men. We stood by the government when it wanted help, a delegate from Mississippi wrote President Johnson. Now, will it stand by us?
The blacks, like, that means that, you know, when the North needed help to win the war, the black soldiers were there to help them. And now that they're just requiring like the same treatment, that the country stands back for black rights and suffrage when the blacks need it the most.
In New Orleans, hundreds of black men declared they were ready to fight for the right to vote. Militant whites in the city vowed to stamp out black agitators and radical Republicans. President Johnson dismissed the growing signs of trouble. At midday on July 30th, 1866, New Orleans exploded. At the state convention, a mob attacked white radical Republican delegates and their black supporters. The Republicans were chased out of the convention hall and shot down. Black men were murdered in the streets. By the time federal troops restored order, 34 blacks and 3 white radicals had been killed.
And the radicals say, we told you. We told you that unless you stamp out this serpent of white power in the South, unless you kill it, it's going to rise up again.
The growing violence in the South turned the midterm elections of 1866 into a referendum on presidential reconstruction. With Union war hero Ulysses S. Grant at his side, Johnson barnstormed the Northeast and the Midwest. Dubbed the Swing Around the Circle, the speaking tour was an unprecedented effort to sell his policies to Northern voters. It was a disaster. At the podium, the president traded insults with hostile crowds and blamed the slaughter in New Orleans on Congress.
He called the leadership of the Republican Party traitors. He even referred to himself as a Jesus figure being crucified on the cross of radical reconstruction.
Okay, so New Orleans, there's like a massacre. People were people were shot to death, and that was right before the re-election, like the election again, right? So President Johnson, Andrew Johnson wanted to get re-elected, so he decided, you know, he was already losing popularity in the North for his controversial decisions to, you know, to destroy black rights. So he decided, you know, what better way to gain their votes and trust back than to go on a tour in the North. So he went on a tour, but then he ended up just like swearing at the Northerners and saying that the New Orleans that happened, like the massacre, was the fault of the Congress, not white supremacy groups in the South, and that just made him more unpopular.
Which to many Northerners was just a kind of pathetic political rhetoric.
Many Northerners felt that black people should receive only minimal constitutional protections. And it is the South's intransigence and the policy that President Johnson pursues by encouraging the South to reconstitute itself that drives many Northerners away from his position.
The Atlantic Monthly called the president egotistic to the point of mental disease, insincere as well as stubborn, cunning as well as unreasonable, vain as well as ill-tempered. That fall, Republicans won 3/4 of the seats in both houses of Congress, enough to override any Johnson veto. In only 18 months, the Radicals had gone from a fringe minority to the center of Republican leadership. Now it was their turn to define the course of Reconstruction. Thaddeus Stevens was 75 years old, so frail that he had to be carried into the House of Representatives by admirers. In a voice his colleagues could barely hear, the tireless Stevens made a final plea for federal intervention in the southern states.
Congress has been sitting here, and while the South has been bleeding at every pore, Congress has done nothing to protect the loyal people there, white or black, either in their persons, in their liberty, or in their property.
In March 1867, both houses of Congress again rejected a veto by President Johnson and passed the Radicals' Reconstruction Plan.
So the Radicals went from the small group within the Republican Party into the majority. They became the majority party, and they basically were so popular that the president was irrelevant at this point. They just ignored the president's veto.
The former Confederate states were divided into 5 military districts, each commanded by a general.
And this Reconstruction Plan was the original kind of vision that Lincoln had. It was supposed to be a long and gradual reconstruction with like high levels of supervision from the North, right? So North Army would go down to ensure that the South are carrying out equal treatment to the blacks.
Power to enforce law and administer justice. New Southern governments would be created. They would have to ratify the 14th Amendment. Their new state constitutions would have to be approved by Congress. And black men would have the right to vote.
This really was a remarkable leap in the dark for world history. It's the first large-scale experiment in interracial democracy that had existed anywhere.
When Tunis Campbell learned of the Radicals' bold plan, he immediately decided to run for office. Marshall Twitchell.
So as the radical Republicans gained the popular support, and as the blacks kind of started to strike back a little, Tunis Campbell immediately took this opportunity. Since they could vote now, that means that they can be in office in the government, work for the government as well. So he immediately tried to run for government. Marshall Twitchell did the same.
Also went into politics. As a delegate to Louisiana's Constitutional Convention, it was like nothing he'd ever seen. More than half the delegates were black. Within a year, Andrew Johnson would be impeached by the Senate for high crimes and misdemeanors.
And because Andrew Johnson was so shit and, that was like in so much argument with the Congress, he got impeached. But he wasn't thrown out of office. He was one vote off from being thrown out of office. But that just, it kind of secured the fact that he will not be able to run for government again. Run for president and win again.
His presidency would survive by a single vote. When radical Reconstruction passed, there were still 38,000 federal troops stationed in the South. In Kate Stone's Louisiana, more than half the regiments were black.
Women like Kate Stone look at this and see embodied in black soldiers their greatest fear. These black men, many of whom have been slaves only 18 months earlier, they wear that uniform as if it's their right, as if they're Americans too.
For white Southerners, this is not just politics. It's about your very core being. Congress is going to do certain things, but there's almost a kind of guerrilla warfare of the domestic, of the local, of people just refusing to let society change.
From the point of view of the White South, the Civil War was a tragic mistake. They had only defended what they understood to be their constitutional rights. It was not that they had disrupted the Union, engaged in an act of treason. They felt the North was a vicious aggressor, committed to a perversion, which was black equality.
Okay. So for the South, with the whole like radical Reconstruction plan that the radical Republicans did, sending military down in the South to make sure that the Southerners would not treat the blacks the wrong way and, you know, kill them and such, the South found it a violation of their rights and found it like quite like literally disgusting. And because a lot of the troops that were sent to the South were black soldiers, which made it even harder for the South to, you know, accept it.
This sense of a grievance and sense of injustice only grew. That this was something that was not to be accepted.
In North Carolina, the last legislature elected solely by the white vote adjourned. The legislators marked the occasion with a whiskey punch party. Before long, the state capitol was in a drunken uproar. With the ballot in black hands, many expected to give up their seats to former slaves. "We have lost all hope of escaping the vengeance of the Northern people," wrote one senator, "and all are preparing for the worst."
Okay, so in the South, as blacks like started voting, be like, you know, running for office in their southern states, and them being so popular, the white people in the South realize that they're gonna lose their vote and they're gonna lose their power and influence over black people. The black people are gonna run the states, and they just had one last, like, I guess not party but meeting, where they just gave up and they thought everything's fucked up.
Reconstruction does by suddenly enfranchising blacks. It communicates the message that all of a sudden these people who have been part of the background scenery, who have been stage props, they're going to come onto center stage and be actors. And that is deeply disturbing to white Southerners and to many people in the North.
Across the South, black newspapers exhorted every black man to seize the moment. "He owes it to the martyrs who have fallen to procure his rights," declared a Georgia newspaper. "He owes it to his God who has wrought his freedom. Let the Republicans of the North know the strength and character of the colored vote in the South. Vote. Vote in spite of every threat." To freedmen, the ballot was sacred proof they were bondsmen no longer, but citizens at last.
All right, so finally, we just talk about how, you know, the South, black newspapers were just advertising everywhere that black people can now vote, and with all these votes, they can turn the table, and they can, you know, majority of the black, like the senators in the South would be black, and they thought that it was a great time in history where black people would finally rise and take some control into shaping their future in America. Okay, that's episode 1.